Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones. So glad you could join us. And we are continuing our journey through the Tao Te Ching, and we are continuing in chapter 68, I believe it is. Moving right along. Yeah, 68. So today we're going to be working with the Feng and English translation, and we'll bring in a couple of other things as well, but that'll be our primary source. And it starts, a good soldier is not violent. So we can definitely sense, a lot of kung fu movies here where you get to see the training that happens, and it's all about, developing the type of warrior that is not actually violent or angry or driven by any of those types of modes. Is definitely, picked up here. Maybe this is the source of some of that. I don't know. But there's a couple of aspects of this I think we should look at. One is, in the previous chapter, it was really focusing on a little bit more of a, let's say, um, more from, let's say, the mother's perspective of thinking about the yin yang aspects and how the different attributes that are typically associated with more masculine aspects, in particular, we focused on bravery, is actually coming from this idea of the mother's heart. So we have this yin yang aspect of these different attributes where everything has both things contained within itself. But the point that was being made in the previous chapter is that if you try to go for, let's say, the bravery without the mother's heart, you get things out of balance, and it doesn't work quite the right way. So if the foundation is in the part that you don't see, that yin, that absence part, that becomes the foundation for how the other piece works. So if we think about the idea of a soldier, where you're definitely going to incorporate this idea of bravery, and in some respects, we could look at the actions that a soldier might take as violent. But if those are arising from more of that yin perspective, and let's just take that mother's heart again, there's a different way we can look at this concept of protecting or working for this other, more nurturing or compassionate goal that is going to have a different sense than the idea of violence. When I think of violence, I think of something that has a little bit more to do with the type of intent. So some people maybe don't make that distinction. If somebody, stabs somebody, whether it was for a good reason or not, they would still consider that, let's say, a violent act. So I'm curious your thoughts on this, if about making that distinction in terms of intent and the motivation of the warrior. If the warrior is motivated from this place of compassion, that is leading to actions that are maybe around protecting or self-defense, as opposed to the more generic term here we've got for violent. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, as you may guess, Jim, from being a Sansu practitioner, this is a subject I've given quite a lot of thought to. And to me, there seems to be a distinction between the term soldier and the term warrior. Um, but I can think of two ways of interpreting this. One might be in the context of self-defense. You said if you stab somebody, whether it's for a good reason or not, which might sound kind of weird, but theoretically, there could be a situation where causing harm to one individual is the path that results in the least amount of net harm overall. So if somebody is on a murderous rampage and they can't be communicated with, and the only way to stop them is physically, then you might need to cause harm to one person in order to prevent harm from coming to others. But in that situation, if it's motivated from self-defense than you do the minimum harm that's necessary. And even after you have harmed someone so that they're no longer a danger, then you would still try to render aid. Like you might, try to patch them up and stop the bleeding or whatever, because the aim is to do the least amount of harm. Um, uh, Another interpretation with the word soldier implies a member of a military. As a warrior could just be a warrior, but a soldier is a part of a military, which is a command and control environment, where a soldier is not violent for the sake of violence. A soldier follows orders. If the order is to attack, the soldier attacks. If the order is to stand down, the soldier stands down. It's sort of a hierarchical command and control context, where the soldier doesn't have any uh, desire to do violence. They don't get into brawls at the tavern and things like that. They just follow orders.
Yeah,
And
and
if they dig a ditch, they dig a ditch.
right. Yeah, and we should probably do a little clarification on the term that's being translated soldier here, which is she or sha. I'm not sure exactly which way it's pronounced. But it it is in some of the translations it goes down this road of soldier, but it's not necessarily maybe even the right way to translate it. I think it ends up this way because of the larger context of the passage that we'll look at here in a moment. But the concept has to do with essentially a learned person or a competent person, like somebody who's maybe rising in the ranks of a political position. So sometimes it's translated as competent person or something along those lines. So I would hesitate on reading too much into the word soldier here in terms of how we translate this, because that might not actually be the best way to translate that word. But I definitely hear what you're saying. If we're thinking about a soldier, there's a whole nother layer that comes into play in terms of the responsibility to follow orders from above, even if they don't necessarily understand the motivation behind it. Um, so,
It
yeah,
seems like a good translation for that concept might be martial artist, even more so than soldier or warrior, as in somebody who is studying and training the martial arts, because of course the term kung fu just means skill developed over time. So you're talking about somebody who's competent. It sounds like you're talking about somebody who has good kung fu.
yeah, and so there's ways that you can get to the idea of soldier here or warrior. I think the primary reason it's not translated warrior is because the next line uses something that's more frequently translated as warrior. In this case, they used fighter. But we'll stick with the first line for a moment, because I'm curious other people's thoughts if they see a distinction between somebody who maybe performs an act that could be considered a violent act because they're trying to act in that protective way, versus what we might call a violent person who seems to be somebody who's doing those types of actions but with a different type of intent. Do other people see a distinction between that, or do you see this as violence is just violence across the board?
I definitely see the difference in like having a more feminine source of where this would be coming from. Like I feel like the being violent just to be violent is not like it's more probably happening out of fear or insecurity or something like that. But protecting something is more of like a response to somebody who's just being violent rather than doing it without being provoked. Like it's more of a response than a proactive action.
Kind of like we were saying last time about not getting between a mother and her child type of a thing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Also makes you think about like if you think about like you go to a gym, you have those guys that are like super huge and scary looking, but they're typically the softest, nicest person in the world. It's kind of on that same line of they're not violent people, but do not, but they'll be violent if they have to be, not out of nature.
Yeah. Well, I think the key thing I want to notice here then is when we're thinking about that yin yang, that there's the background or the hidden part or the non-visible aspect that becomes the foundation for the thing that is visible, is part of the core that they're trying to bring together here. That within this yin yang kind of a concept, if you are focusing more on that yang side, it's going to be out of balance. And you might end up with something that's more along the lines of being violent as opposed to simply being protective. And so that's one of the things they're bringing in. But the other key aspect, if we're thinking about last chapter, focusing a lot on more of the maternal ways of approaching things as opposed to, let's say, the patriarchal, then here we're looking at more of the masculine side. And one of the key things that I think we can start to see here is there's this aspect of restraint, right? So that the soldier or the warrior or the competent person is still acting, but not from a place of violence. And so there's a restraint, even in the face of whatever type of provocation. They're approaching it from a certain angle, let's say, that isn't just simply giving into what we would think of more generally as violence. And we see this then developed in the second line with the idea of the good fighter is not angry. So what they are doing, again, thinking about that motivation, isn't coming from this emotional rage or this anger, but it's maybe more calculated in the sense of, well, when you end up in a situation where you become fearful, as Taylor was bringing up, or if you're a situation where you allow that anger to rise, what happens mentally is a lot of our functionality kind of narrows the focus quite a bit to specific types of actions because it's more of this fight or flight situation that takes over. And you lose the capacity to have that broader range of options because you've kind of constricted what was possible in terms of how your mind is working at that point. So the idea here, and again, we see this being promoted within a lot of the martial arts traditions, is how to avoid becoming angry when you're engaged in whatever it is that you have to engage with, so that you can remain retain your capacity to see the bigger picture about what's going on and have more options before you than rather than more constricted path forward that might develop as a result of that fear or anger. And then this third one, which in this translation is translated as winner, this is also frequently translated as something like a conqueror or someone who has conquered. So we'll just go with winner here, somebody who's, let's say, successful, maybe on the battlefield or something like that. It says in this translation is not vengeful. So we can see again this violent, angry concept kind of flowing through to this third situation of, okay, I've won. Now I'm not going to just continue to, decimate because, that's not my goal here. The other way that this line is frequently translated and maybe is a little bit more literal is that the conqueror doesn't engage the enemy, which brings up a whole different line of thinking. So within the Feng and English, I think they're trying to be a little bit more concise in each of these lines and have kind of a, soldier, violent, fighter, angry, winner, vengeful type of simple arrangement of how they're doing the words, which brings out a similar concept. But there's, a whole nother aspect, if we're thinking from a martial perspective, of not engaging the enemy that comes into play. So here, the idea of the conqueror figuring out how to win or be successful in a confrontation is maybe one who's going to be able to do that without actually engaging the enemy, or in this case, to have more of that vengeful kind of approach. So we definitely see how these things are really pulling up a lot of the categories that would be maybe thought of more on the masculine side in terms of that anger, that violence, that vengefulness. And it's saying that the good version of this from each of these categories is one where restraint is used, that they're not simply defaulting over to these, that the restraint is maybe coming because they are having more of an appreciation for that yin side, where these yang components come from, so that they are in balance or in harmony with how things should move forward, as opposed to kind of losing that balance, falling too far to that yang side and functioning in a way that's not going to bring about that balance or harmony. There's one last character that they bring up here. And this one frequently is translated employer, which is interesting, but also maybe equally in terms of the different translations I was looking at, is also translated as leader. And again, we have a single word here, humble. The more literal would be something along the lines that the leader leads from beneath. And so that idea of being below, we've seen this several times, and definitely the idea of humble is a way of summarizing that nicely. So we've got different categories of, or let's say roles, that are more on the masculine side from classical China, where we're seeing more of a focus on the yin and not being just all the way over on the yang side, and that these things are tempered, and maybe the big consistent pattern in each of these might be that idea of using restraint. I think is probably a through line that we can see for each of these. Now that we've got all four of these up, do you guys have some thoughts or questions about what these are saying?
I think each line for me is saying, like, the beginning of the line is something that's more masculine, and then the end of the line is something that would be more feminine. So it's giving balance in each statement.
Yeah, that's a nice way to put that. Anybody else have some thoughts? All right. Well, let's continue. I want to bring up a couple of quotes from Sun Tzu, who is frequently pronounced as Sun Tu. He's the author of the Art of War, which also comes out of this Warring States period. And he has a couple of things to say that are relevant to what we were just looking at. And we can see definitely a connection between these two. First one, he says, a ruler must not mobilize his armies in anger. A general must not engage the enemy in wrath. Anger can turn to joy, and wrath can turn to gladness. Now, pause before we continue there. When it says that anger can turn to joy and wrath can turn to gladness, what do you think is being implied there?
Battle being won or something?
Yeah. You can mobilize, it says here, and it's possible to do this from a position of anger and wrath, and then you could be successful, in which case now these are going to turn to joy and gladness. But then he brings in the but, right, of, okay, so what's the consequence of this? He says, but once a state is destroyed, cannot be restored. And once a person is dead, he cannot be reborn. So I very much like earlier when we were looking in the Daodejing, it says, even if you happen to be successful in battle, which would be like uh, everything else is broken down, it's a last resort. It should be treated not as a victory, but as a funeral. And Sun Tzu is bringing up a very similar point here. He's like, okay, you go in and you destroy the city, there's no fixing it. And once somebody's dead, you can't bring them back. So there's a very strong caution that's being given here that, don't act from that place of anger. Don't act from that place of wrath, because you might be successful in what you're trying to do, but at the end, it's stuff that can't be undone, right? They're things that you can't unwind, that you can't, say, oops, you can't say, I'm sorry. It's an irreversible transition that you can't restore. So I think this is a very interesting correlation to the type of thing that we're seeing in the Tao Te Ching.
To me, this seems to be speaking to the transience of emotions, and by saying you might be angry today and want to hit somebody, but if you just hold off, tomorrow you might not still feel the same way, and you might be glad you didn't hit them. Or like it's saying anger can turn to joy, meaning emotions can change. Wrath can turn to gladness. Your emotions can change. And you might be motivated to do something in one emotional state that you would not want to do if in a different emotional state. So it's kind of saying if you're going to resort to violence, it should be motivated not by emotion, but I guess by some kind of calculation or rationality or something like that, because emotions can change, and we can be motivated out of anger to do something that we later regret and wish that we hadn't done when we feel differently.
Yeah, I like that. That is a extremely relevant to the passage, I think. Yeah, there our thoughts and our emotions are fleeting and they do change. And so, yeah, we could see, yeah, I might be angry, but if I act on that, I might have the regret because tomorrow I might have a completely different feeling. Yeah, very good observation. I guess I'll see if anybody else has some thoughts before I turn this to the next quote. Okay, here we go. To win every battle is not supreme excellence. Supreme excellence is to conquer without fighting. And we can really see how this tied into that idea of the conqueror not engaging the enemy, right? That there's a whole nother way that this can be approached, and certainly the direction that he's elaborating on here, very much a similar kind of concept. Okay, so let's go back to the Tao Te Ching and we'll continue. So these 4 statements that we had about each of those roles not behaving in a particular way, it says this is known as the virtue, and this is the Feng and English translation of da. So it's known as the virtue or the da of not striving, or frequently also translated as not contending, which is what we've seen in many of the other passages. So to review then, da is an expression of something that is fully manifesting or fully, let's say, in harmony with Tao, these patterns of how things unfold. So if somebody is in harmony with the way of things, then they are not going to be approaching from a striving in the sense of trying to gain or trying to climb that hierarchy. They're not trying to take something that doesn't belong to them. And it's also this idea that it's not contending, it's not fighting against things. It's understanding this more of how do we work with things, bringing in that harmony, bringing in that balance. And so those 4 opening statements of seeing the different ways of approaching life from each of those roles, is saying here that this is known as, or demonstrating then, what duh looks like. And it has another similar statement then where it says, this is known as the ability to deal with people. And I think that's kind of there's a lot of different ways this line kind of gets translated, but I'm pulling one other one that I think states it a little bit better. It says, this is called making use of others' strengths. And this is a translator, I believe it's Jun Kung. Yeah, because here it is, we've seen in the previous line was talking about the leader or the employer, that he's doing it from beneath. And in the previous chapter, we had this idea of elevating others above you. I think that's kind of the idea here, is that you're recognizing where other people have strengths and you're utilizing them. You're taking advantage of those things in a positive way, not a negative way, in the sense that there's space for the different abilities and skills that people have. It's not something where you're trying to do everything yourself, or everything has to be exactly the way you're trying to figure it out. You're taking advantage of, in a positive way again, what strengths other people have. The other thing that's kind of funny, I was rewatching Game of Thrones not too long ago, and it was interesting. Was it the Dothraki, the horse riders? And one of their lines that they would say is, "It is known." And it kind of makes, when it says, "This is known," it made me think of that.
It's so funny you say that. When we were on the first few lines, I was like thinking about Game of Thrones and how nobody wins in war. And I think that comes up in my head a lot when we talk about these, when it comes to like conquering and, stuff like that. I'm like, I go right to Game of Thrones.
It's an
Like
interesting.
the line about a good conqueror does not, I forget yeah, Daenerys at the end of Game of Thrones and what she does, and yeah, that was like exactly what I was thinking about. That's so funny.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting political commentary in that series. Any
Yeah, also in House of Dragon, if you haven't watched that, it's
I've been
a
watching.
lot of yin.
Well, it
It's
is
awesome.
right. Seeing how the different women, now it's curious because House of Dragons, not to get off too far on a tangent, but the two women that are the key roles in that show seem to be operating from more of that yin perspective. But in Game of Thrones, with Cersei in particular, and also with Daenerys, they were both females, but they seem to be coming from much more of a yin perspective, right? We talked a little bit about the curious aspect of our culture today, where we try to have more of this equality between the sexes, but the way we do it is more in terms of trying to make women more like men, instead of allowing women to actually be women, as opposed to, well, not as opposed, but as having that valued equally as the aspects of what's valued in men, right? Which is a lot of what we're getting to in a lot of these chapters right now, is that more yin aspect that is important as a foundation for how we get to more of those yang actions. So
I think that's why it's interesting to look at how successful Sansa and Arya were, because they weren't trying to act like anybody but themselves. And Arya was more young and Sansa was more yin, but they were both successful in the end in, becoming who they became. And they started off as just kids and they were kind of annoying, but then you see them grow into like these people that have really good values and kind of stand up for who they are, as opposed to trying to be like Cersei, who's trying to, conquer in all the wrong ways.
Yeah.
And Daenerys.
And they both, I really wasn't planning on going down this Game of Thrones route.
I know, but it's
apologize to
relevant. I don't
anybody.
know. It ties in really well. It's just interesting to draw the connections.
Yeah, I apologize to anybody who's not familiar with the shows, but yeah, with Cersei and Daenerys, there still is an aspect of like that mother's heart, right? That comes out over
Yeah.
and over again in terms of not getting between a mother and her children, right? For both of them. It's how they choose to try and do what they do with that protectiveness, right? And the route that they take. Yeah, it is a lot of fun stuff to explore.
Okay, well, here's one little tie-in with the line from earlier about a good fighter is not angry. I think maybe my favorite scene from that whole saga is when um uh you just said her name, Taylor, and I forgot. Sansa's younger sister.
Sansa?
Arya.
The younger sister.
Arya.
Yes, Arya. She kills the king of the White Walkers. There's like, the magical dagger is the only thing that can kill him. And she runs up, stabs, he grabs her hand, and then the look on her face is just this totally blank, like, okay, and she drop, catch, stab. And there's no like anger. It's just almost like this innocent look, like a childlike look on her face, like and then she does this thing that uh it's almost it's so obvious, but most people would think, aha, I stopped you. Oh, right, you have another hand. Oops.
Now we're going to have to add a spoiler to this video.
Hey, it's been a long time. If you haven't seen it by now, that's on you.
Yeah.
I love that scene, and just like the casualness of it. Like, oh, okay, that's fine.
Yeah, it was and maybe that brings in another aspect of subterfuge, right? Of being, in a sense, utilizing the deception of, different things. And also I think the devaluing of not only a woman, but a young girl, right? And that ends up being the thing that is very beneficial in this case. So yeah, it brings up a lot of interesting concepts for sure.
And I think that has relevance for self-defense as well, because in a lot of self-defense, there's like knife defense where you grab the knife and you get it away. But if you've actually seen like captured videos of somebody being stabbed to death with a knife, like I've actually seen this happen where a guy's being stabbed, he grabs a hand, the guy just takes the knife in his other hand and keeps stabbing. Like that's actually physically, mechanically realistic to the sort of thing that happens in that situation.
Mm. Well, hopefully we won't have to watch videos like that, but
Not unless you want to, but if you do want to watch them for educational purposes, they can be found on the internet.
okay, good to know. All right, well, let's continue our story then. So we have a final concluding statement, and it says, this since ancient times has been known as the ultimate unity with heaven. So, and I specified that that's from the Feng in English here because I'm going to bring in a couple of other translations. But here, I guess we could say is the thing that's tying this all together. And as we've seen from the Taoist perspective, when we're talking about heaven, this is really another way of talking about nature. So there's something about what they're saying in the preceding statements that is pulling together this idea that if you're going to be truly in unity with heaven, right, going to mirror heaven, then these are the types of attributes that you will exemplify. Again, I think the last chapter and this chapter really have to go hand in hand because we've got the maternal aspect and then we've got the masculine aspect, but also from the perspective of really focusing on the yin, that they're saying here is what we see, just as we saw a couple lines earlier about the manifestation of Da, that this is, we can see Da as, in a sense, this unity with heaven, this mirroring of the natural way of things, that this would be the primary example of how that comes together. A couple of other translations of this final line. One is from the Addiss and Lombardo, which is our other primary text. It says, "This is called matching heaven's ancient ideal." And this is a little bit closer to what you have in the underlying text. There's this matching or this mirroring of heaven that is a key statement that's coming into play. And then you've got ancient ideal. And then in this other one, this is called matching heaven's ancient way. So both ideal and way here are being translated from the word, I believe it's pronounced G. And this is the same word that is used in Tai Chi, which in English, unfortunately, is often pronounced Tai Chi. But it has to do with this idea of ultimate. So Tai Chi means great ultimate. And so here there's this ancient or old ultimate that is being talked about. And with the final two translations, it's bringing in this idea that there's a way from long ago that was like this, right? That there is this matching or this way of mirroring nature that is ancient, that is the way things had been way back when. And so if we think about the Daodejing representing, in a sense, this indigenous or let's say Paleolithic worldview, we can see how this kind of comes to fore. And then if we think about the Feng and English translation, it's taking it as something that has been known as the ultimate way. And you can see here they're actually using the word ultimate. But instead of saying like the anciently, like ultimate ancient, it's saying the ultimate unity or that ultimate mirroring or matching of heaven since old times. So it's a very, I think, unique way that Feng in English has translated this line, but I think it also brings out a very important point in terms of this would get at the core of what that unity with heaven looks like, whereas the other translations, which are much more common in a lot of the other ones, it's bringing out this idea of something that was this way from long ago, like the ultimate past, as opposed to the ultimate unity. So it's interesting, the different perspectives on this. Any thoughts on this closing line? Did it feel like this chapter was pulling together the core aspects of what that would look like, or did it seem a little brief?
I don't know why, but it felt like two separate chapters in one, like two small separate chapters in one chapter. I don't know. I can't tell you why I feel that way, unfortunately, but it just felt divided.
Well, frequently the chapters will start with something that is meant to provoke. So those 4 opening statements were kind of the provocation because they might be contrary to what people would normally think. And then the second half is really looking to explain it. And it does it very quickly, right? So the 2 statements about, this is known, one, in the sense of being that proper expression of Tao, and then the other in terms of how to work with people, are 2 key things for sure, especially in the second half of the Daodejing, where it's focusing more on the social aspects of the political concerns. This idea of being in harmony and how do you work with people. And then this concluding statement, that this is the ultimate unity or that mirroring of heaven I think if we put it
But-
again back in the context of that Warring States period, we can see how this would be a really strong statement in that regard about what's wrong, why things are so out of whack, and the key of how we get back. But I'm sorry, Taylor, you're going to say something.
Oh, I was just gonna say I really like the line about that's how you work with people.
Hmm.
Just in general. Like I think I talked about this a little bit. I think it was last week. Even now, like an example now that most people can relate to is like in customer service or working with any kind of client or really anybody. Like if they show up and they're upset about something and they need to talk to you about it and they come at you aggravated and you respond calmly and don't match their energy, chances are like they're gonna come down to meet you.
Mm.
Like if you don't go up to meet them, they're gonna calm down and come to meet you. And I think that this chapter kind of highlights that. Obviously, they're talking about war. But I think it's a good lesson even now for people who are not in the military and they're just dealing with conflict in their life in any sense.
Yeah.
That if you just remain level-headed and don't match that, we'll call it violence, emotional violence maybe, it'll go a lot more smoothly.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, there are just people like that out there, and my mother happens to be one of them, who is just really rude to customer service people. If she ever talks to customer service on the phone, she's just like really rude and nasty to them, no matter what, unfortunately. So I know there are people like that out there too.
Yeah. Yeah.
I used to deal with them. I worked IT help for a long time at a university, and we had a lot of older students who would call in and they would need help like copying and pasting. And, it's not, they didn't grow up with technology, like we had students who were like 80 and they would be frustrated and understandably, they're just trying to get their work done. And you would just kind of have to patiently walk them through it.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
actually,
I'm
I
sorry, go ahead.
I was a couple weeks ago. It seemed like the issue came up of getting angry at inanimate objects. And I think
Yeah.
that's one of those situations where people like get angry at the computer, which has no effect on the computer whatsoever, but it affects you and it affects people around you, but it doesn't actually solve the problem. I guess a
Yeah.
good computer expert is not angry.
Yeah, we can definitely apply it in a lot of different areas of life. So it's I think it's a good challenge to our thinking and review of different approaches that we get from going through the Daodejing. So I'm glad that other people are seeing some value in that as well. Well, at this point, I think we'll bring it to a close. And I want to thank you guys again for joining today. And if you're watching this as a video and you'd like to be a part of this discussion, you can register your email at www.kinship.cafe, and you'll get a weekly email with the latest videos as well as links to this Friday morning Zoom conversation. And if you happen to be in the Southern California area where we meet in person. So hope to see you guys next week.
Cool. Bye. Thanks, Jim.